Welcome to our deep dive into the world of couples therapy.
Yeah.
You know, our listener is particularly interested in the psychodynamic approach.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating one.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of explore how this lens can help us unlock a deeper understanding of our relationships, beyond just the surface level.
Absolutely. It's amazing how often our past experiences can influence our present relationships without us even realizing it.
It's like we're bringing baggage, from previous relationships into our current ones.
Exactly. Think of it this way. You're carrying a suitcase filled with experiences, and your partner is bringing their own, and sometimes those suitcases clash.
Oh, they definitely do.
Couples theory, especially the psychodynamic approach, helps unpack those suitcases and understand why they're bumping up against each other.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So it's not just about resolving those surface level arguments,
Yeah.
but understanding what's causing that friction in the first place.
Precisely.
Yeah,
It's about recognizing the individual needs and anxieties and even past hurts that each person brings to the relationship.
that makes sense. The source material also mentions other types of couples therapy too, like the systems approach or the behavioral approach.
Yeah,
How is the psychodynamic approach different from these?
that's a good question. While other approaches might focus on communication patterns or behavior modification, the psychodynamic lens dives deeper into the unconscious forces that shape our interactions.
So it's kind of like understanding the underlying code that's running the program of your relationship.
You got it.
Okay, this is
Yep.
about getting to the root of the issue, not just putting a Band-Aid on it.
Exactly. And a key part of this approach is understanding the impact of our past, particularly our childhood relationships.
Ah, so this is where object relations theory comes in. I've heard that term before, but could never quite grasp it.
Yeah, it can seem complex at first, but it's actually quite intuitive when you break it down. Think about it this way. Our early relationships, especially with caregivers, create a blueprint for how we understand and approach relationships in general. And we unconsciously seek out partners who fit this blueprint, even if those patterns are based on conflict or unmet needs.
So we might be drawn to what's familiar, even if it's not necessarily healthy.
Yes. And that can lead to unconsciously reenacting past conflicts in our current relationships. It's like playing out the same scene with different actors.
Wow, that's fascinating. The source material also mentions this idea of projective identification. What is that all about?
Projective identification is basically when we project those disowned parts of ourselves onto our partners. It's like seeing in them what we don't want to see in ourselves, and this can lead to explosive arguments over seemingly trivial things.
So it's not really about the dirty dishes, it's about something deeper that's being triggered.
Exactly. The source material gives a great example with Anitha and Vikram, a couple who got into a huge fight after cuddling. You'd think cuddling would bring them closer, but the physical intimacy actually brought up anxieties for both of them.
Wait, they fought after cuddling? That seems counterintuitive.
Right. But for Anitha, the closeness triggered her fear of vulnerability, while for Vikram, it brought up anxieties around dependency based on his early childhood experiences.
So even positive experiences can trigger conflicts if they touch upon those deeper anxieties.
That's the power of the psychodynamic approach. It helps us understand those seemingly irrational reactions and see how our past is influencing our present.
That makes a lot of sense. The source material also distinguishes between empathy and defensive projection. Can you unpack that for me?
Absolutely. True empathy is about understanding your partner's experience, even if it's different from your own. Defensive projection is about getting rid of unwanted feelings by pushing them onto someone else.
So it's the difference between truly listening and trying to understand versus just deflecting.
Exactly. And this leads us to another important concept, transference. It's how those past relationship patterns can reemerge in therapy itself. The therapist becomes a blank screen onto which we project our past experiences.
Interesting. So the therapist isn't just a referee, they're also a mirror, reflecting back those unconscious dynamics.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just individual transference onto the therapist. There's also something called the marital unconscious, which are the shared assumptions and anxieties that drive a couple's behavior. It's like they're following an invisible script.
Wow. I'm starting to see how this all connects. The source material uses the example of Anand and Jaya to illustrate this. Can you tell me more about their story?
Sure. On the surface, Anand and Jaya's arguments were about mundane things like a basement wall or their child's minor injury, but as their therapist dug deeper, it became clear that these seemingly trivial issues were masking much deeper anxieties.
I'm curious to hear more about their anxieties and how the therapist helped them uncover those deeper issues.
Yeah, let's dive into that. Let's dive into that. So we were talking about the marital unconscious, those hidden anxieties and patterns that drive a couple's behavior.
Right. It's like they're speaking a secret language they don't even know they're using.
Yeah.
So how does a therapist help a couple crack that code?
Well, think of the therapist as kind of a detective of the heart. They're looking for clues in the way the couple communicates, the recurring themes of their arguments, even their body language.
So the therapist is paying attention to all those subtle details that the couple might not even be aware of themselves.
Absolutely. And, they're also paying attention to their own reactions to the couple.
No reactions.
Yeah, this is called countertransference, and it can be incredibly insightful.
Countertransference. It sounds like the therapist is bringing their own baggage into the session.
Well, it's not baggage, but rather the therapist's own emotional responses to the couple.
Okay.
So, for example, if a therapist is feeling frustrated with a couple, it could be a sign that the couple is enacting a pattern of frustration in their relationship.
So the therapist's feelings become like another piece of the puzzle helping to illuminate the couple's dynamic.
Exactly. And the therapist uses all of these pieces, the couple's communication, their history, the therapist's own reactions, all of it to help the couple gain insight into their marital unconscious.
That makes sense. You mentioned that the therapist also focuses on the here and now of the therapy session. What does that mean?
It means that the therapist isn't just focusing on the content of the couple's arguments, but on the way they interact with each other in the therapy room.
Oh, so the therapy session becomes a microcosm of their relationship.
Precisely. And by working in the here and now, the therapist can help the couple see those unhealthy patterns as they're happening in real time.
It's like holding up a mirror to the couple and saying, look, this is how you're communicating. What do you notice?
You got it. The source material actually gives an example of this here and now work with a couple named Thrivity and Talasi. This case highlights how transference, those projections of past relationship patterns, can play out in couples therapy.
Oh, interesting. So Thrivity and Talasi were projecting their past experiences onto the therapist.
Exactly. Thrivity, who is grieving the loss of his mother, was unconsciously seeking comfort and support from the therapist. This triggered Talasi's own anxieties about abandonment and feeling left out.
It sounds like Thrivity was looking for the nurturing he didn't receive from his mother, and Talasi was reacting to her own past hurts.
That's a great insight. And the therapist, recognizing this dynamic, helped them see how their individual transference reactions were contributing to the conflict in their relationship.
It's amazing how these seemingly unrelated events from the past can have such a powerful impact on the present.
It really highlights the importance of understanding those deeper layers of the relationship. The source material also mentions the importance of the frame in object relations couples therapy.
What does frame mean in this context?
The frame refers to the structure and boundaries of the therapy, things like the frequency and duration of sessions, the consistent presence of both partners, and the clear delineation of roles.
So it's about creating a safe and predictable space for the therapy to take place.
Exactly. And one important aspect of the frame is the recommendation that couples therapy and individual therapy be conducted by different therapists.
Why is that? Wouldn't it be more efficient to have one therapist for both?
It might seem that way, but there are a few key reasons to have separate therapists. For one, it prevents conflicts of interest and maintains confidentiality.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if one partner shares something in individual therapy that could be harmful to the relationship, the individual therapist doesn't have to worry about breaching confidentiality.
Right. And it also helps prevent the therapist from being pulled into the couple's dynamic in a way that could be unhelpful.
How so?
Imagine if the therapist was also the individual therapist for one partner. The other partner might feel jealous or resentful of the time and attention the therapist is giving their partner in individual therapy.
Oh, so it's about creating clear boundaries and preventing those complicated triangular dynamics.
Exactly. It allows for a more focused and effective therapeutic process for both the individual and the couple.
This all makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners so far?
I think the biggest takeaway is that couples therapy, particularly the psychodynamic approach, goes far beyond simply resolving arguments. It's about understanding the deep-seated patterns often stemming from our past that are shaping the relationship.
It's about becoming aware of that marital unconscious, those unspoken assumptions, anxieties, and patterns that drive behavior.
Exactly. And by gaining this awareness, the couple can start to make more conscious choices about how they interact and relate to each other.
This has been incredibly insightful. So far, we've uncovered how those unconscious forces operate in relationships.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, how do couples actually begin to heal and grow once those forces are brought to light?
That's a great question, and it's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. So in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how couples actually begin to heal and grow once those unconscious forces are brought to light.
That's what I'm really curious about. It's one thing to understand these concepts, but how do couples actually put them into practice?
Right, it's like having a map but still needing to navigate the actual terrain. So how do couples move from understanding to transformation?
Exactly.
Well, it's important to remember that there are no quick fixes in couples therapy. It's a process that requires patience, courage, and a willingness to do the inner work.
That makes sense.
Oh.
So once a couple starts to see those unhealthy patterns, how do they actually start changing them?
One of the key mechanisms in psychodynamic therapy is called re-internalization. We've talked about how we project those unwanted parts of ourselves onto our partners.
Mm.
Re-internalization is about taking those projections back, owning those aspects of ourselves that we've been trying to avoid.
So instead of seeing those negative qualities in our partner, we start to recognize them in ourselves.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging those shadow sides of ourselves that we've been projecting outward. This can be challenging, but it's also incredibly liberating.
I can imagine it's not easy to confront those less desirable parts of ourselves. What makes it liberating?
Well, when we stop projecting those negative qualities onto our partner, we stop seeing them as the enemy. We can start to relate to them with more compassion and understanding.
That makes sense. It's like taking the blame off the other person and looking inward instead.
Yes, and it allows us to take responsibility for our own growth and healing. Instead of trying to change our partner, we focus on changing ourselves.
The source material gives the example of Anand and Jaya, again, to illustrate this.
Yes, Anand and Jaya's story shows how powerful re-internalization can be. Remember how Jaya projected her fear of abandonment onto Anand, constantly worrying about his health?
Yeah, and Anand projected his feeling of being controlled onto Jaya, resisting her attempts to care for him.
Exactly. But through therapy, they both began to see their role in the conflict. Jaya started to recognize her own anxieties and work on feeling more secure within herself. And Anand started to acknowledge his own fear of death and take more responsibility for his health. Not for Jaya, but for himself.
So they each stopped blaming the other and started looking inward.
Yes. And as they did, their relationship began to shift. They could communicate more effectively, offer each other support without judgment, and build a more secure and loving bond.
It's a beautiful example of how self-awareness can transform a relationship.
It really highlights that we all have those suitcases filled with past experiences that we bring into our relationships, and those suitcases are bound to bump into each other sometimes.
But through awareness, empathy, and a willingness to do the inner work, we can learn to navigate those bumps with more grace and compassion.
Exactly. That's the beauty of the psychodynamic approach. It gives us a framework to understand those deeper forces at play, allowing us to create more conscious and fulfilling relationships.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on relationships.
I'm glad to hear that. Remember, understanding is the first step toward transformation.
And as we wrap up, one final thought for you to ponder. If our partners often reflect back parts of ourselves we haven't fully dealt with, what does that say about the power of self-awareness in improving our relationships? Until next time, keep diving deeper.